Hi reading group, I hope you all are doing well. For the video and for the work for this week, we are going to be talking about the topic of both 21st century literacy and text complexity. So as I had mentioned in the welcome video, to get to all of the content and the topic for each week, you will click on the icon for that week. So I'm going to go ahead and click us into text complexity. And as I mentioned, we are going to be tackling both kind of more broadly speaking, this idea of what does it mean to be a literate person in general, and then within your subject area specifically. And so you guys are going to first be reading 2 chapters out of the adolescent literacy textbook. And for these chapters, chapters 1 and 10, they are going to be talking more just about what literacy looks like today. Traditionally, literacy was always, in the past, if you could read, write, speak, listen, engage with vocabulary, that's what we considered a literate person. And while those things are still true, something we're going to continue to explore within the class, and then specifically the chapters are going to be exploring, is what does it mean to be literate in the 21st century, in a time when really your students have all of their answers right at their fingertips with their cell phones and their devices. What does it mean to be literate when it's just as much about applying those skills to unique situations and literacy demands as just sitting down and reading a traditional text. So even within this course, as I mentioned in the introduction, being literate isn't just engaging with traditional text, but it's also engaging with visual text. It's engaging with videos. It's engaging with all the kinds of text that your students are going to come across, and how do we bring those into the classroom, teach students how to read them, engage with them, and create them. And so again, you're going to be reading about that in the adolescent literacy textbook. Within the first chapter, just kind of thinking about how do we even measure literacy. And then within chapter 10, they're going to be talking about all of these new demands and abilities that are related to literacy. So for those of you who are doing the class online, you guys then will be discussing that also as it relates to a TED Talk that John Green gives on the Nerd's Guide to Learning Everything Online, and talks about some of his own experiences, somebody who's now like a very famous, well-established author, and his own experience with texts in schools, and doing some comparison with what you're reading in chapters 1 and 10. And then we're going to shift our attention to text complexity. And so for the text complexity chapter, you guys are going to be reading out of the Hinchman text. And text complexity essentially is important for teachers because it tells us with any text that you are going to be putting in front of your students and you're wanting them to engage with, what are the potential barriers for students being able to read that text. So thinking about this, if I'm going to have you guys read this text, it helps me to know what might make this text particularly challenging for my students. So when we think about text complexity, we think about both quantitative factors and qualitative factors, and your book is going to address a little bit of both. And then you guys are going to have some practice with analyzing a text using qualitative factors. So first, when we think about quantitative factors, and your book will get into this in more detail, but quantitative factors essentially are things that we can often more easily measure. You guys have probably heard of Lexile Level, or maybe when you were reading in your own middle school and high school, you did some kind of assessment that said what your reading ability was using quantitative factors. And so you may have had a Lexile range, or you may have had like numbers assigned to a book depending on what your school used that would tell you, yes, you have the ability to read this text. And those, like I said, those are often generated by, computer generated. They take into account things like the difficulty of the vocabulary in a text, the sentence structure, the paragraph structure, the use of transitions, things that the sentence length, things that you could, essentially plug in and determine, if your students would be able to read it. When we think about textbooks that you use in school, most of the complexity level is going to fit within an appropriate range for students who are at really the 25th to the 75th reading ability. So kind of for your average readers, for your students that aren't lower level, but below grade level, and then also maybe not as much for your students who read at a very high level. But most of the textbooks that you're going to be reading within a class are going to fit within your students who are kind of at the 25th to the 75th percentile, kind of your average readers, your readers who are reading at grade level. And so with quantitative factors, again, kind of the text you're going to be given to put in front of students, that will fit within an appropriate Lexile level. So where that becomes relevant is for text that you are going to bring in for your students. So for those of you who are English teachers, that may be, novels that you're bringing in. Those of you who are history teachers, if you want to bring in a primary text, if you're looking at something that was written 100, 200 years ago, the vocabulary is going to be more complex. The language in general is going to be more complex. The sentence structure, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to make that complex if we're looking at something that was written a couple of hundred years ago. Those of you who are in science, as you're bringing in text, you may find something that's a great supplemental text online, but as you start to look through it, you may realize that, again, the vocabulary is especially challenging. And so, how do you know, quantitatively speaking, if a text is appropriate for your students? And there are even, something that they mentioned in the text, there are even a lot of programs and things online. Like you can go to Lexile.com and search textbooks. You can search many texts to determine, how complicated a text is. Nowadays, and we'll get into this more differentiation, a lot of text for students, like on News ELA, and I think on Common Lit and on Scholastic, you can actually choose articles and have them adapted to a specific Lexile level. So we can even use that information. Students take an assessment. We know what the Lexile level is, and then even adjust which version of an article they read depending on their Lexile level. So that's a little bit more about quantitative factors. Again, you're going to learn more about that as you are reading, but just a brief introduction. And those are numbers that we can often get. As I said, we can get online. Texts tend to have a Lexile level. The Lexile level of the text you're going to be using in general with your students, or that you're given to use with your students, probably fits within an appropriate Lexile level. What gets quite a bit more complicated are these things that we call the qualitative factors that might make a text complex. So for example, you may have a book that is written at a pretty simple Lexile level, even a children's book or a young adult text, but the themes that the text deals with are much more complex. And it's things that are factors that make a text complex that may not fit as simply into the quantitative factors. So anything else that may be a barrier for students for reading the text. Another good example related to that is there may be cultural barriers. If you have students who are going to be reading about a different time in history, if they are reading about, I'm thinking about like in a music classroom, if they're going to be reading a piece of music that's written in the language is in Latin or, something like that, and it's been adjusted so that it's now in our modern day English language, or if you're going to have students reading musical texts that are written in another language, those are things that might make it complex. And so then for teachers, our question is going to be, and we're going to pick up on this next week, is how do we use information about text complexity to determine how we're going to introduce that to our students, what we're going to have them do while they read the text, and then what we're going to have them do after they read the text. So you guys are going to get a chance to practice that with your assignment for this week. As a brief reminder, those of you who are taking the class online, you guys will do the initial discussion post by Thursday at midnight, and then you'll do your responses by Sunday at midnight, and we are going to be discussing, again, what does it mean to be literate and literacy skills, and then you guys, your practice assignment for the week, which is due by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, is you're going to get a chance to evaluate the qualitative factors of what makes a text complex. So you'll click into assignment 1, you'll click into text complexity, and you will fill this out, and then you will be just submitting it back into Canvas. So you'll see for this assignment, this is actually taken from another text that I have on literacy, that asks you to consider qualitative factors for text complexity. So you're going to be choosing a sample text, and I'm going to show you in just a minute how you can get into some sample text, or if you want to find your own sample text, but you're going to be choosing from the sample text and just a section of the text. You don't even need to use a whole chapter. You could use like a section within a text if you choose one of the textbooks. And you're going to be going through and first kind of using these different domains. So looking at the text to say, you know, would you consider the levels of meaning, lower complexity or higher complexity? And then give me a brief rationale for why you chose the level of complexity that you did. Same thing with the structure, same thing with the language, and then the knowledge demands. You're going to go through, you're going to choose lower level or higher level based on these descriptions, and then give me a brief rationale for why you chose which one you did. After that, then, you're going to be addressing the reader task considerations, is what Beers and Probst refer to it as, and you're going to be going through and considering these qualitative factors in terms of barriers that may arise for students to engage with the text. So you can see that there's some specific questions there. Are they going to be interested in it? Even that, right? If you're going to read, students are going to be reading a text that is going to be particularly dull or uninteresting to them, that affects, as teachers, what we do then before we put a text in front of students, which we're going to continue to get into in the future. But basically, if the students are interested in the text, if students have the background ability, when you're going through this section, I want you to think about students who are reading essentially at grade level. You know, do you feel like 7th graders, if you use 7th grade science textbook, do they have the background to read that text? So you can kind of think about students who are reading around the grade level. Do students have the attitude and maturity to read the text? You know, for example, I'm thinking about a high school health class when they may be engaging with topics that may be particularly sensitive. This could also, you know, when we think about history and politics, this may be something that you would want to consider if these are texts that students may feel very passionate about, students may feel embarrassed by. We're going to be talking about immigration in the history class, for example. Does the text provide interesting discussion? You know, are the students going to want to talk about the text? And then based on these factors, you're going to be addressing, you know, what seems to be the greatest barrier for students reading the text. So for example, I mentioned in the past cultural barriers. If students are reading, one of the example texts in English is the Malala text. So if students are reading about kids in you know, a country like Afghanistan, where they don't have Pakistan, where they don't have any background on education for girls in those countries, they probably wouldn't understand why a young girl was targeted and shot because she was just going to school, because they're not going to understand in a country where, you know, women have a right to education, why this would have happened to Malala. So for that text, it would be cultural barriers. But you're essentially going to list some of the barriers to the students wanting to engage and being able to engage with the text. And this is some initial brainstorming, and then we're going to come back to this next week when we get into comprehension and making decisions about what we do before students read the text, while they read the text, and after they read the text, based on what you found to be complex. So then the last thing, so for the sample text that you guys are going to be choosing from, there is an entire page with sample text. So if you go back to the home page and you click on sample text here, you see that I've posted some sample text depending on your content area. Throughout the course, you're also welcome to, you know, if you maybe have a text from a practicum, or you just have a sample text that you used in the past, or want to search for a sample text, you're welcome to do that. But probably the easiest way to find a sample text is just to go through and choose one of the ones that's posted for you here. So you choose one of those texts, go through and do that analysis of the quantitative and the qualitative, and some potential barriers for students being able to or willing to read the text. So that's it for this week. Reach out to me as you have any questions before the discussion or the assignment. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Hope you have a good week.